Wherever you are right now, I hope you're comfortable. Maybe the light around you is dim, or the world outside your window has grown quiet. Perhaps there's the soft hum of something familiar, a fan, a whisper of traffic, or just the steady rhythm of your own breathing. Tonight, let's drift into the forest. Not the forest as a postcard or a hiking trail, but the living, breathing organism that it truly is. A world older than human memory, where every movement, every whisper of wind, every fallen leaf becomes part of a language few of us have ever truly heard. Our story begins with a question. How do trees remember the wind? It's a poetic question, yes, but also a scientific one. Because trees, though rooted and silent, are not still. They live in slow motion, listening, adapting, remembering. Each gust of air that brushes their leaves, each storm that bends their branches, leaves behind a trace, a pattern woven into the very structure of their wood. If you were to walk into a forest after a storm, you might notice something subtle. Some trees lean a little more to one side. Some have thicker trunks. Some seem to shiver quietly, even when the air is calm. To most of us, this seems random, the way nature just happens. But to a biologist or an ecologist, it's evidence of memory. The memory written in wood. Inside a tree, memory doesn't look like ours. There are no neurons, no synapses, no electric sparks firing in the dark. But there are patterns, structures shaped by experience. When a strong wind bends a tree, its tissues feel that pressure. Cells deep inside the trunk sense the strain and begin to grow differently. The wood becomes denser on the side that bears the brunt of the wind. This is called thigmomorphogenesis, the biological process by which plants alter their growth in response to mechanical stress. It's a long word for something deeply intuitive, the way living things remember touch. Imagine this: a sapling sways in a strong wind. Each time it bends, it learns a little. Over days, weeks, and seasons, the tree builds itself around those lessons. Its fibers toughen. Its trunk thickens where the strain was greatest. Its branches redistribute weight to keep balance. So when the next storm comes, the tree is ready. It doesn't consciously recall the previous winds, but it has become its own memory. In a way, this is how all of nature remembers, not through thought, but through form. The world keeps a record of what has happened by changing shape. Listening to pressure. If you place a stethoscope against a tree during a windstorm, something scientists have actually done, you would hear faint clicks and pops inside. Tiny microfractures form as the tree flexes, not breaking but adjusting. These are not signs of damage, but signs of adaptation. Deep inside the xylem, the water-carrying vessels of the tree, vibrations travel faster than sound. When wind pushes a branch, it sends a wave of tension through the whole organism. Cells sense it through structures in their walls called mechanoreceptors. These receptors translate pressure into a kind of cellular language, one that triggers chemical messengers and alters gene expression. The tree, in other words, listens through its own body. It doesn't think the way we do, but it feels the shape of the world and responds accordingly. And over years, sometimes centuries, those responses accumulate. A pine that grew on a windswept hill becomes stout and low, while its cousin in the valley rises tall and straight. The difference between them is not chance, it's experience. A memory of motion. We often think of plants as static, passive backdrops to the moving life around them. But they move too. They move in ways that unfold over hours, days, or decades, so slowly that the human eye rarely notices. Time-lapse photography changed that perception. When scientists began to film trees and plants over long periods, they discovered a hidden choreography. Branches sway and twist with intention, leaves tilt to follow light, roots curl through soil like patient fingers searching for water. When the wind arrives, this hidden motion becomes visible. It's not just random fluttering, it's a distributed dance of flexibility and restraint. Each leaf adjusts its angle to reduce drag. Each branch bends just enough to absorb energy without breaking. Over time, this motion leaves a record. The cells that felt the greatest strain grow differently. New wood forms with fibers angled along the lines of force. The memory of the wind becomes architecture. Some researchers describe this as structural memory. The tree's shape is a living history book, each ring and curve a record of what it has endured. In that sense, a forest is an archive, a slow accumulation of environmental memory, written in cellulose and lignin instead of ink. The tree's inner library. If we cut across a fallen trunk, and let's do so gently in imagination without harm, we see a circle of rings. Each ring marks a year of growth. Light and dark bands alternate, one for the fast-growing spring, one for the slower, denser summer. But the rings tell more than time. They tell of droughts, floods, fires, and windstorms. Dendrochronologists, scientists who study tree rings, can reconstruct centuries of weather from these patterns. They can see the cold snap of a distant winter, the year a river overflowed, or the seasons when high winds shaped the land. The tree does remember these events as stories. It remembers them as structure, as subtle changes in density, in fiber direction, in the chemistry of its wood. But to those who know how to read it, that structure is a narrative as rich as any human chronicle. In the forests of Scandinavia, for example, scientists have matched tree ring patterns across thousands of years, creating a continuous record that reaches back to the Ice Age. In that timeline, you can trace the echoes of ancient winds, the same atmospheric rhythms that once brushed the faces of our ancestors. So when you stand beside an old oak and feel the breeze stir its leaves, you're standing in the presence of memory. Not your memory, not mine, but the earth. The language of sway. In 2012, researchers at the University of Florence did an experiment with poplar trees. They exposed some to gentle mechanical shaking and left others untouched. The shaken trees grew shorter and sturdier, their trunks thickened, their cell walls reinforced. Even weeks after the shaking stopped, their growth patterns remained different. This was not random, it was remembered. A kind of embodied learning. It's a principle that applies beyond trees. Grass, vines, even tiny seedlings all respond to touch and motion. The famous experiment by Charles Darwin and his son Francis in the 1880s showed that when a seedling's tip is touched repeatedly, it changes its growth direction, as though it has learned where not to go. Darwin called this plant sensitivity, and he was among the first to suggest that plants might possess a primitive form of awareness. Today, we might call it mechanosensory memory. But whatever we name it, the essence is simple. Every touch, every gust, every shadow of force leaves a trace. In that sense, a tree remembers the wind the way water remembers the shape of the riverbank, not by thought, but by form. The patience of the living world. As the light fades in our imagined forest, the air grows still. You can almost hear the quiet, that deep, resonant kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of listening. If you were to stay here through the night, you'd see how the forest breathes. Tiny pores on the leaves, called stomata, close to conserve moisture. Sap pressure changes, shifting subtly like blood flow. Even in darkness, life continues its slow dialogue with the air. Somewhere in the soil, fine roots move, so small you'd need a microscope to see them. They press through grains of earth, mapping the underground world inch by inch. And just like their branches above, these roots remember pressure, direction, and resistance. They learn the architecture of their surroundings. Through networks of mycorrhizal fungi, delicate white threads that connect roots across vast distances, one tree can even warn another. When wind damage or insect attack occurs, chemical signals pass underground, priming neighbors to adjust their metabolism or strengthen their tissues. It's not speech as we know it, but it is communication. And communication in its simplest form is memory shared. The forest that learns. Scientists studying repeated wind exposure in poplars found something remarkable. Not only do trees change their structure in response to wind, they retain a kind of genetic readiness. Even new shoots that grow later exhibit different sensitivities, as though the memory has been imprinted in their developmental programming. This raises profound questions about what it means to learn. If a tree can adjust its growth strategy based on past experience and pass that adjustment to new tissue, then the boundary between reflex and memory begins to blur. Perhaps life doesn't need a brain to remember. Perhaps memory is the fundamental property of being alive, the capacity to change because something once happened. From that perspective, every cell on Earth carries memory, the memory of pressure, light, heat, chemistry, time. And trees, being so long-lived, simply remember longer. The forest at night becomes a cathedral of patience. The wind stirs again, and leaves rustle in overlapping rhythms, 1,000 small conversations blending into one. You realize, listening, that the trees are not passive against the wind. They are participating in it. Each gust is both teacher and sculptor, and the forest, as a whole, becomes a memory of motion turned into form. When you walk among them tomorrow, perhaps you'll notice how each trunk curves just so, how each branch bends toward light or away from prevailing wind. That's not randomness. That's memory, slow, biological, unspoken memory. And in their silence, they have been listening longer than any of us have existed. When morning comes to the forest, it doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, a quiet silver light filtering through mist and branches. The ground, still damp from the night, exhales a faint, earthy scent. Somewhere above, the first thin rays of sun brush against dew-soaked leaves and the forest stirs awake. You can feel it, a slow turning toward light. Each leaf reorients, each branch adjusts ever so slightly. Its movement measured not in seconds but in hours. The forest, in its own language of slowness, is remembering the direction of warmth and wind. Last night we drifted through the idea that trees can remember, not through thought or words, but through the way they grow. This morning we'll look deeper into the shape of that memory. Because what begins as a response to pressure becomes something more, a record of resilience, of experience etched into living architecture. The geometry of adaptation. If you look closely at a tree that spent its life on a windswept cliff, you'll notice how its branches twist and curl away from the prevailing gusts. The wood grain itself spirals, following invisible lines of force. This is not random artistry. It's biomechanics, nature's own engineering. Wood is anisotropic, meaning it doesn't have uniform strength in every direction. It's strongest along the grain, weaker across it. So when a tree grows, it constantly adjusts its internal geometry to distribute tension and compression. Over time, these microscopic adjustments accumulate. The trunk thickens on the side facing the wind, the reaction wood. In conifers, this is called compression wood, rich in lignin, dense and dark. In broadleaf trees, it's called tension wood, formed on the opposite side, pulling the tree upright like a muscle. It's as if the tree has an inner memory of balance, constantly recalibrating itself, learning the shape of the world's forces. When scientists model this process mathematically, they often find that trees behave like self-optimizing structures. Given enough time and pressure, they naturally evolve the most efficient form for their environment, minimizing stress, maximizing strength, using the least material possible. It's evolution, yes, but it's also adaptation within a single lifetime. Each tree is an experiment in remembering how to stand. Rings as records. The next time you see a cross-section of a tree trunk, Whether in a museum or an old log, notice how the rings aren't perfectly concentric. They're often thicker on one side, thinner on another. Those asymmetries are stories. The thicker side might mark the direction of greatest growth, perhaps facing the sun or away from the wind. Sometimes a scar appears, a dark streak of resin where lightning struck or insects burrowed. Each irregularity is a line in the diary of that tree's life. Dendrochronologists can use these variations to infer wind direction decades, even centuries ago. In the twisted pines of Patagonia, researchers have traced patterns of prevailing winds across millennia by studying how compression wood forms on the windward side of trunks. It's remarkable, the atmosphere itself, recorded not in instruments or charts, but in the bodies of living trees. The tree doesn't know it's keeping records. It simply responds, and that response is the record. The memory is not separate from the body. The memory is the body. Cellular echoes. Let's travel deeper, not through the forest, but through the tree itself. Imagine zooming down through the bark, past the phloem and cambium, into the wood cells where growth takes place. Here, in this microscopic world, the story of memory continues. When wind pressure flexes the trunk, certain cells sense tension through changes in their membranes. Tiny proteins, known as mechanosensitive ion channels, open to allow calcium ions to rush in. That small electrical pulse triggers a cascade of biochemical signals, activating genes responsible for strengthening the cell wall, rearranging cellulose fibers, or increasing lignin production. In that moment, a physical event, a gust of wind, becomes a biological response. And if the same force happens again and again, those signaling pathways become primed, more responsive. In some species, this even leads to epigenetic memory, small chemical marks added to DNA that influence how genes are expressed later, long after the wind has stopped. So when we say that a tree remembers the wind, it's not metaphor alone. There's a molecular trace, a biological echo of motion. The wind's signature. Every place on Earth has its own signature of air. The steady trade winds across the tropics, the erratic gusts over mountain ridges, the soft, circular breezes of coastal mornings. Each leaves a distinct fingerprint on the vegetation it touches. In Japan, along the Sea of Okhotsk, there are forests where all the trees lean inland at identical angles, not because of a single storm, but because of a lifetime of wind. The same pattern appears in the Falkland Islands, where the relentless southern gales sculpt trees into natural arches, known locally as flag trees. To stand beneath them is to see time itself bent by the wind. These living sculptures are not accidents. They are evidence of persistence, memory written in form. And while we might call them deformed, nature would call them adapted. In the language of the forest, every curve and lean is wisdom accumulated. The conversation beneath. Memory in trees doesn't live only in wood or cells. It lives underground too. Through a network of fungal threads, the mycorrhizal network, trees share resources and information. A gust that breaks one tree's branch can send a chemical signal through the soil, triggering nearby trees to alter their metabolism, sometimes even shifting nutrient flow. Susan Simard, a Canadian ecologist, famously showed that these underground connections can transmit carbon, nitrogen, and chemical messages across entire stands of forest. Some older trees, the so-called mother trees, act as hubs, redistributing resources to younger ones when times are hard. When a storm passes, these networks change. Root connections are strained, nutrient exchanges fluctuate, and the signals of stress echo underground for days. So even if a tree stands alone above ground, beneath the soil it is never solitary. And if memory is the capacity to retain and respond to experience, then perhaps the forest as a whole remembers, too, as a single, distributed mind made of roots, fungi, and slow communication. Wind as teacher. For a young tree, wind is both threat and teacher. In a windless greenhouse, trees grow tall but fragile. Their trunks are thin, their wood soft. When exposed to the outdoors, they often snap in the first storm. This is why foresters sometimes deliberately expose saplings to controlled wind, a practice called mechanical conditioning. A gentle breeze, repeated daily, produces stronger, more resilient wood. It's as if the tree must learn to live with motion, to let go of rigidity and find strength in flexibility. There's a lesson there for us too. Because humans, like trees, often grow stronger when we bend. When life pushes and pulls at us, we adapt, forming invisible rings of resilience. The tree remembers the wind, we remember the struggle. Both forms of memory are stories written in structure. The whisper of time. Stand in a forest on a calm day, and you can still feel traces of past storms. The way certain trunks lean, the open gaps where branches once fell, the twisted shapes of trees that have been pushed for years in the same direction. Every piece of the landscape is a whisper of time. Wind is one of Earth's oldest sculptors. Long before humans or even mammals, wind shaped the distribution of seeds, the erosion of rock, the evolution of plant forms. The first trees, towering lycophytes of the Devonian period, 400 million years ago, learned to anchor themselves against the air's invisible current. Without that challenge, wood might never have evolved its remarkable strength. In a sense, every tree alive today carries the genetic memory of those ancient winds, the pressure that forced their ancestors to grow thicker, taller, more resilient. So when we talk about memory, we're talking about inheritance as well, the knowledge of air encoded across generations. The breath between worlds. At a slower rhythm, wind and tree form a duet, a back-and-forth exchange of gases, energy, and motion. Wind stirs leaves, leaves shape wind. The boundary between them is porous, fluid. Photosynthesis depends on this movement. Carbon dioxide enters through tiny openings on leaves, while oxygen exits. The balance of gases that sustains life on Earth is maintained by this delicate, rhythmic breath between the atmosphere and the living green. In this way, the wind doesn't just shape trees mechanically, it sustains them physiologically. And they, in turn, shape the composition of the very air that drives them. It's a feedback loop, a conversation between two ancient forces. If we were to slow time to the pace of trees, we might see the world differently. The gusts of air that seem momentary to us would become long, rolling waves. The seasons would appear as tides of motion. And through those tides, trees would sway, grow, and remember. The philosophy of stillness. There's something quietly philosophical about the way trees remember. They do not resist the wind with force. They yield and reshape. They absorb motion and translate it into strength. Human memory often clings to experience through recollection, by holding it tightly. But trees show us another way, remembering by becoming, by integrating change into structure. Perhaps this is the wisdom of the forest, that memory need not be conscious to be profound. That endurance is a kind of intelligence, and that the world itself, through every bending branch and weathered root, keeps record of what has passed. When you stand beneath a canopy and hear the wind sigh through the leaves, you're listening to memory in motion, a story being rewritten each moment, yet built on every moment that came before. And maybe in some small way, the wind remembers too. The forest does not awaken suddenly. It rises gently, as though surfacing from a dream. The morning mist has lifted, and light falls through the canopy in long, golden shafts, catching the slow drift of dust and pollen. The air itself seems alive, carrying whispers of distant branches moving. The faint percussion of leaves brushing against each other. If you stand very still, you begin to realize something subtle. The forest is never silent and never still. Even in calm weather, trunks creak almost imperceptibly. Leaves flutter in microcurrents. Roots expand and contract with moisture. Each sound, each movement, is a continuation of the story we've been following, the story of memory written not in words or thoughts, but in the patterns of life itself. Because the wind never really stops, it only changes form. And trees never really forget. They keep remembering through shape, through chemistry, through time. Echoes of the wind inside the wood. Inside the heartwood of a mature tree, that dark, dense core no longer carrying water, traces of the world still remain. Resin hardened by a storm's wound, microscopic cracks sealed by the tree's slow repair, a change in the ratio of carbon isotopes revealing the pattern of sunlight decades ago. Even dead wood keeps memory. In ancient bogs, scientists have unearthed trunks preserved for thousands of years, their rings still bearing the rhythms of wind and drought from long before recorded history. By analyzing the structure of these rings, we can reconstruct not only temperature and rainfall, but also the intensity and direction of prevailing winds. The trees that once stood alive in the ancient winds of the Bronze Age now speak to us across millennia, through the language of growth and decay. They remind us that memory in the natural world does not depend on consciousness. It depends on persistence. The intelligence of flexibility. When engineers design tall buildings, they study trees. They watch how trunks taper upward, how branches distribute stress, how roots spread wide to anchor without rigidity. Unlike most human structures, trees do not resist wind completely. They yield, absorb, and return the energy. In biomechanics, this is called resonant damping. Each tree has its own natural frequency, a rhythm at which it sways. When wind matches that rhythm, motion amplifies. But trees have evolved ways to shift their resonance by adjusting water content and internal stiffness. It's as if they tune themselves to the wind. Over a lifetime, a tree's resonance can change, growing slower and more grounded with age. And this tuning is part of their memory. It's not stored in the brain, but in the interplay between physics and biology, a dynamic relationship between matter and motion. Humans, too, carry such resonance. The way we adapt to change, the way our voices and bodies respond to the world, all reflect a kind of lived tuning. But trees show us what it means to embody that principle for centuries, not decades. When the wind teaches the forest. In 1999, a powerful windstorm swept across Central Europe, felling more than 200 million cubic meters of timber. For months afterward, ecologists studied the fallen trees and those left standing. They noticed that in mixed forests, where species of different flexibilities grew together, damage was less severe. The wind's energy was dissipated unevenly, shared among forms. In a monoculture forest, by contrast, identical trees resonated together, amplifying the destruction. It was a quiet revelation. Diversity makes memory resilient. A forest that remembers many forms of movement, tall, short, broad, narrow, can survive better than one that remembers only one way to stand. And in that way, the memory of wind becomes a lesson in community. Each tree, by its structure, contributes to the forest's collective ability to endure. The whole becomes stronger than the sum of its trunks. This, too, is how ecosystems think, not through thoughts, but through interactions shaped by history. Trees and the wind in art and thought. For as long as humans have watched trees, we have seen in them reflections of ourselves. In ancient China, poets wrote of the pine that bends but does not break, a symbol of endurance. In Norse mythology, the world itself grows from a tree, Yggdrasil, whose roots and branches hold the sky and underworld in balance. In Japanese Zen gardens, wind-sculpted pines embody impermanence, their forms shaped by unseen forces. Across cultures, wind and tree have always been metaphors for resilience and change, one shaping, one yielding. And perhaps that's because, even without science, people have long intuited what we now measure in laboratories. That to survive, one must move with the storm. That strength comes not from stillness, but from the ability to remember motion and remain standing after it. In art and philosophy, this truth takes on human meaning. In biology, it takes on structure and chemistry. But the essence is the same, the conversation between force and form. The slow intelligence of trees. There's a growing field of research called plant neurobiology, though the name is controversial since plants have no neurons. Its central idea is that plants can process information, respond to stimuli, and even learn over time through biochemical networks. When researchers repeatedly expose plants to specific stimuli, light, vibration, even sound, they find that plants adjust their future responses. In 2014, a team led by Monica Gagliano performed an experiment with Mimosa pudica, a plant that folds its leaves when touched. After repeated harmless drops, the plant stopped closing their leaves, as though they had learned the touch was not a threat. Weeks later, the memory persisted. If a small herb can remember the absence of danger, how much might a forest remember the constant presence of wind? Each vibration, each subtle pull of air, leaves traces in countless cells and tissues. The tree is not aware, but it is adaptive. It is, in a very real sense, intelligent, just not in the way we define intelligence. The silence that speaks. At dusk, when the forest begins to cool, you might notice how the air settles. The wind fades, and with it, a kind of stillness arrives that is almost physical, as though the world is holding its breath. But even now, inside the trunks, there's movement. Sap pressure shifts as temperatures fall. Fibers release tension. Microscopic clicks echo faintly within. The tree remembers the wind not by sound or image, but by strain and relaxation, by the delicate balance of forces that it has learned over a lifetime to manage. It's a language of stress and recovery. And every night the forest rehearses it, the slow breathing of wood and air. There's a quiet humility in that, a sense that memory doesn't need to be loud to be deep. The global memory of wind. Step back far beyond the forest, beyond the continent even. The winds that shape one tree are part of the same planetary circulation that moves dust from the Sahara to fertilize the Amazon. Particles from ancient volcanoes settle into tree bark in Alaska. Salt spray from distant oceans embeds in redwoods. Every gust, every storm, is part of a vast atmospheric memory, a system that has been circulating since before mammals existed. When trees grow, they capture a fingerprint of that air in their tissues. Stable isotope ratios of carbon and oxygen in tree rings reveal patterns of global wind and climate stretching back thousands of years. In this way, the memory of one tree becomes the memory of the earth. We can read in its wood the signature of El Niño, the trace of jet streams, the pulse of monsoons. The tree is a historian of air. Its rings an archive of the invisible. The lessons hidden in the canopy. We often think of memory as a human privilege, the thing that separates us from the rest of life. But when we look closely, we see that everything remembers, just in different ways. The coral remembers temperature in its skeleton. The glacier remembers centuries of snow in its ice. And the tree, patient, rooted, ancient, remembers the wind in its form. There's comfort in that continuity. Even as human memory fades, as generations pass and words are forgotten, the living world continues to hold its quiet record. When a child looks up at a tree, they're seeing centuries of remembered motion, branches shaped by storms long gone. The wind we feel today will be remembered, too, not in our minds but in wood yet to grow. A meditation on endurance. As night settles again, the forest darkens to deep green and blue. The wind returns gentle now, like a long exhale. The leaves shimmer faintly in the starlight. If you listen closely, you can almost imagine the trees sighing, releasing what they've held all day. And in that sigh, there's wisdom, a kind of message that says, everything that moves through you leaves a trace. Every difficulty, every storm becomes part of who you are. Like the trees, you are built from what you've endured. The forest is a teacher, but a patient one. It doesn't rush to speak. It only demonstrates quietly, persistently, that to live is to adapt, to bend, to remember without clinging. And maybe that's what memory really is, the shape left behind after experience has passed through. So as the wind fades and the world grows still, perhaps you'll remember the trees, how they listened, how they learned, how they became the very shape of survival. And so, as we continue to drift deeper into this quiet study of wind and memory, let us look upward again to the forest canopy. Because what happens in those emerald heights is nothing short of symphonic. Each leaf, each tiny petiole, that slender stalk connecting the leaf to the branch, responds to the wind in its own rhythm. It twists, pivots, and trembles. At first glance, it might seem chaotic, but the longer we watch, the more we realize there is an order to this dance. The forest canopy does not move like an ocean whipped by storm. It moves like breath, a shared, invisible respiration, a slow exhale of motion that ripples across the treetops. When the wind arrives, the trees do not fight it. They yield, distribute, and share the load. Some researchers, studying the biomechanics of trees, describe this as the dynamic reconfiguration of canopy architecture. A poetic way to say, trees bend to become more aerodynamic, reducing resistance and stress. In the process, they change their own geometry, not permanently at first, but enough to alter how future winds will touch them. In a grove of beeches in Germany, scientists once attached tiny accelerometers to branches, recording their motion during storms. What they found was astonishing. Even when branches looked still to the human eye, micro-vibrations continued long after the wind passed, a gentle quiver, like the afterecho of a bell. It was as though the wood retained the wind's fingerprint. And in time, those tiny echoes triggered slow biochemical responses, changes in growth hormone levels, shifts in cambial activity, subtle recalibrations to brace for what might come again. This, in essence, is memory without neurons, a kind of mechanical cognition, written in cellulose and sap instead of synapses and neurotransmitters. When you imagine a forest now, perhaps it feels less like a collection of still things and more like a thinking body, a distributed intelligence. Each trunk is a nerve, each root a wire, each gust a signal passing through the system. Wind doesn't just sculpt trees physically, it also shapes their social lives. In dense stands, neighboring trees influence one another's sweat. Foresters have a term for this, crown shyness, the mysterious phenomenon where the outermost branches of tall trees avoid touching, leaving thin ribbons of sky between their crowns. Some believe this helps reduce the spread of disease or insects. Others think it minimizes mechanical damage from collisions and high winds. But perhaps more simply,